Hey, this is Jeff, and this is our Wednesday devotion for Holy Week. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew 24, and we're going to be trying to figure out what is it that Jesus is saying exactly in this passage, and how is it that he says that that generation back then will witness the events that he talks about in this chapter. So let's begin in 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming, 'I am the Christ,' and many will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, 'There he is,' out in the desert, do not go out. Or, 'Here he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the earth to the other." And we'll stop there for right now. Now let's keep going. "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away till all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." So the question that we have for the day is, what does it mean for Jesus to say all this stuff we just read about will happen before that generation passed away that he was talking to? So very clearly, to just kind of establish some context, Jesus and his disciples have gone to the temple. The disciples are very kind of overwhelmed and amazed at how beautiful the temple is. It's a huge building with several large courtyards, and much of it's covered in gold. It's a very beautiful, very expensive, very elaborate place. And so, hold on, I'm getting my notes ready. All right, and so Jesus Jesus is very aware of what they're thinking and what they're talking about. And so he says, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another. Everyone will be thrown down." And so the disciples come to him later at the Mount of Olives, and they ask him the question, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Now, let's talk about that word, end of the age. What does that mean? Well, it comes from the Greek word suntaleia, which means a completion or an end. Now, this doesn't mean a termination. So, for example, think of, let's say you work at Taco Bell and you sneeze in someone's taco and you hand it to them. You are fired. You are terminated. Your time there is no more. You're done. Goodbye. Es toto finit. Now, let's go to a different scenario. Let's say it is your graduation and you're walking across the stage. They hand you a diploma and you walk off the stage and you flip your tassel over. We as adults would look at you and say, this isn't the end of your life. This is the very beginning. You have transitioned from being a child in the school system to now you are an adult ready to join the workforce. You're an adult ready to contribute to society in meaningful ways. So suntaleia would fit that second scenario, that this isn't the termination of something. This is you transitioning into something else. You're being ushered into a new age. And so when the disciples say, what will be the sign of the end of the age? They're not saying, what's the sign that everything will be terminated and completely wiped out and erased? They're saying, what is the sign of when this new age is ushered in? When what we're in now will be transitioned to something different. So no doubt this is referring to when will the kingdom of God come to earth and completely change everything. And so when we talk about Matthew 24, we have to keep something in mind. Now, with this passage, there is some of Matthew 24 that is going to deal with the return of Christ. And certainly that's kind of what the disciples are getting at in this passage. But I want to ask you to keep in mind, what does this passage originally start talking about? And so I want to play a quick game with you. And we can play this game with me being online on this video and you at home. All you might need is maybe a pen and paper. Or if you're good at remembering things, you probably don't really need one. So this is what I want you to keep in mind. Pretend that you're a bus driver. So on the bus, there are 15 people. Go to the first stop, pick up 3 people, and drop off 2. Go to the next stop, pick up 8, drop off 7. Go to the next stop, pick up 2, drop off 2. Go to the next stop, pick up 1 more, and drop off 9. Now I'm going to ask you a question. Now you might know what I'm going to ask you, and so if you want to pause the video right now and go back and rewatch what I just said, that's fine. I'm not going to hold it against you, plus I'll never know that you did that. But I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think long and hard about your answer. Here's the question. What color eyes does the bus driver have? Now you might say, that's impossible for me to know. I don't know that. But I want you to think about my initial question that I started this with. My initial question, or my initial statement was, pretend you're a bus driver. Oh, okay, I forgot that you had said that. Because the reality is, I threw out so many numbers that you may have forgotten that initial statement I said. Pretend that you're a bus driver. And that's kind of how it is with Matthew 24. When we start reading Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. That's what he wants to talk about. So he sets it up by saying, I tell you, not one stone will be left on one another. Everyone will be thrown down. The disciples say, well, tell us about when you return. And Jesus gives a very long explanation to that question. And we might get into this passage and we might forget that initial context, the destruction of the temple, and we might immediately start thinking about the return of Christ. And so what I want to do today is I want to establish something that I would say is extremely important for any passage of Scripture. We want to look at this passage in its context. What is context? Well, context is we take a biblical passage and we try to put it into the text how the author wants us to understand it. So what we want to do is we want to take the full amount of Matthew 24 and put that in the context of Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple. And again, this is going to help alleviate that pesky verse at the end in verse 34 where Jesus says, this generation will not pass away before they see this stuff happen. And so we're going to play another game, all right? Because, again, we want to figure out, what does this phrase mean, this generation will not pass? And, I do have to admit, probably about 5 years ago, a lady at one of the churches I pastored asked me this question. Why does Jesus say this generation when he's talking about future stuff? And I was like, I have no idea. And so that spurred me into a lot of, probably one of the longest researches I've ever done on any passage ever. Anyway, I digress. So I want to play a game with you. I want you to pretend that you're a waiter. And I want you to pretend that maybe I am a food critic. And I'm capable of getting you fired from your job if you mess up my order. And so you come and you ask me, what do you want? And I say, I want a potato. And you say, okay, well, I wonder what kind of potato he wants. Well, you go back to the kitchen and you pull out all the records you have of me ordering potatoes. And so you flip through it and you say, okay, this is the 13th time he's ordered a potato. One time he specifically asked for a baked potato. But 11 times he's asked for fried potatoes. Now, if your job is dependent on you guessing what kind of potato I want, what kind of potato do you think I'm referring to here? And again, let's go back and look at your record. The record says one time I meant baked potato when I said potato. 11 times I meant fried potatoes. If your job is on the line, which are you going to go with? Now, I'm hoping that you're thinking, oh, well, I would go with fried potatoes. That's the best choice. He's ordered that 11 times out of the past 12. And so this 13th time, I think that's how we should understand it. I would hope that you wouldn't say baked potato, because I did refer to that once, but overwhelmingly, I always talk about fried potatoes. And I hope you wouldn't bring me mashed potatoes, because I've never asked for mashed potatoes. I'm very picky on my mashed potatoes, and I wouldn't want to take the chance you wouldn't do them right. Why in the world am I telling you this? Well, let's talk about the phrase, this generation. In the book of Matthew, Matthew uses that word 13 times. Now, there's one time that Matthew uses generation to refer to the genealogy of Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 1, he says, these are the generations of Jesus. Meaning, this is the historical family of Jesus. It happens one time. 11 times, when Jesus says this generation, Jesus means the people that are right here in front of him, listening to his words right now, seeing him right now, hearing him. Why did I point to my mouth when I said hear? I guess because hearing Jesus' words. But they were hearing with their ears. Jesus was speaking with us. So one time it refers to historical families. 11 times it refers to the people right in front of him now. And then we get this 13th generation in Matthew 24. If we go back to my chef illustration of, we're gonna figure out potato based on what he's ordered the most. Let's change that order now. When you look back at your record, one time refers to historical family, 11 times refers to the people right in front of him. If we see the generation now, which of these two are we going to go with? Well, if I had to guess, I'm going to say he probably means the one that he's used 11 times already. And because he's only used this once, and that is kind of a very specific context. There's no time that Jesus says generation where he's referring to the future. So we probably don't want to say that he's talking about a future generation in verse 34, because he's never done that yet. He's not done that at all in Matthew. So the question becomes then, how do we interpret verses 4 through 33 in light of Jesus talking to the disciples? You guys will witness this in your lifetime. Well, what's Jesus' initial context? Jesus' initial context is the destruction of the temple. So we need to put these verses 4 through 33 in that context. Now, that being said, Jesus does talk about his return in Matthew 24. And I would say very clearly, once he gets into verse 36, we see that he does start talking about future events very clearly. Stuff that definitely happens then. And we'll transition through the whole of chapter 25. But let's look at Matthew 24 in a little bit more detail. So we start at looking through this passage, and one thing that Jesus says is, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So how in the world does that fit in with the context of the destruction of the temple? And I guess I should say this. The destruction of the temple happens in 70 AD. So how does that kind of talk happen back then? Don't we typically say that's going to happen before Jesus returns? Well, it could happen. I would suggest it probably will happen. But again, this context is the destruction of the temple. In 66 AD, Israel begins to grow very tired of Israel becomes very tired of Rome's constant oppression and their government. Rome's constantly taxing them, constantly oppressing them, constantly forcing them to observe the Roman culture. And Israel gets sick of it. And they begin to talk about, we're going to revolt against this. We're going to unite together, and we're going to push them out of our capital city, push them out of our country, and we're just going to get them out of here completely. So Israel begins to have these rumors of war. And as Israel begins to have these rumors of war, the other countries around Israel start to listen to those rumors and say, yeah, if you guys go into battle, we're 100% definitely going to join you. Are we going to join them? I don't know. We're going to join you guys. Are we? I don't think we will. Yeah, you guys go ahead and we'll follow behind. And so there's a lot of these rumors that are going on, and Rome begins to murmur, well, if they go up against us, we're going to have to squelch them. And, we've got soldiers in these countries, and they can come join us. And so there's this tension. And the only thing I can kind of compare it to that I'm kind of aware of is when I was very little, still in kind of that Cold War climate of just, all these nations just living in tension. What's going to happen? Who starts this? That's kind of what happens prior to the destruction of the temple. There's just a lot of bated breath. Who's going to launch this? Who's going to start this out? And so there's a lot of wars and rumors of wars. Then Jesus says there'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. And, if you've grown up listening to those guys on TV talk about the end times, that there'll be famines and earthquakes that happen. Well, this is kind of an interesting thing. Prior to 70 AD, many historians of the time remark how many earthquakes happened in that time frame. Even in Acts chapter 11, there's a prophet named Agabus who comes and says, you know what, God has given me a vision. There'll be a huge famine that happens in the next couple years, and that happens during the book of Acts. If you were to read historical documents, you'll find out that prior to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, there's tons of earthquakes in Crete and Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Rome, and even in Judea. So 10 different places in different parts of the world record major earthquakes happening prior to 70 AD. It's kind of interesting. Well, Jesus talks about this abomination that causes desolation. Surely that's talking about some future political figure. And, the reality is there will always be a corrupt political figure who's stealing glory away from God and the church. So I'm not surprised that there'll be one in the future. I'm not surprised that there's one in the past. And I wouldn't be surprised if we studied history, if we could go almost generation to generation pointing out someone who fit that description. But anyway, in Matthew 24, Jesus, again, talking about the temple. Well, who is this abomination that causes desolation? Well, desolation means kind of to make something not sacred, to defile. So it's no secret that the Romans hated the Jewish people and they hated their worship. And so during the temple ceremonies, the Romans would just march into the temple, and while they're performing these sacred rituals, the Romans would just use the bathroom in the temple. So imagine you're a priest in the temple and you're, maybe putting the bread out on the table of showbread, and you're lighting the incense and lighting the candles, and a Roman soldier just comes in, and while you're lighting it, it's like, hey, how you doing? And he starts using the bathroom next to you. Or maybe they squat down in the corner next to the bronze altar where you're trying to do sacrifices, and they do their business. The Romans hated everything Jewish. They even decorated the temple with their own gods and their own symbols. When they were victorious in battle, the Romans would come in with their own sacrifices into the temple, and they would sacrifice their pagan their pagan sacrifices with their pagan rituals to their pagan gods on the temple, or at the temple in the bronze altar. And so the desecration, or the abomination that causes desolation in that context, is the Roman Empire. Okay, well, let's keep going. I probably should have looked this up so I don't have to scan through it. Alright, so Jesus says in this passage, another thing is that the gospel will be preached all over the world. Well, what does that mean? How is it that Jesus has preached or how is it that the gospel has reached the whole world? It's not even done that in our lifetime. Well, it's kind of interesting when you understand what is the world of the time of the gospel. Well, pretty much the known world at the time is the Roman Empire. So we're kind of talking about Spain all the way to almost India. Alexander the Great never gets into India really, and the Romans never really get that far over. And so that's kind of the parameters of what the world is, and maybe the very north of Africa. And they would say this is the whole world. And so we see that before Jesus leaves, he says, well, be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Samaria, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world. And by Acts chapter 2, all of Jerusalem has heard the gospel. By Acts chapter 8, all of Judea and Samaria has heard the gospel. And by the end of the book of Acts, that whole known world that we talked about had heard the gospel. Paul has already started correspondence with Spain. We know that Philip preaches to the Ethiopian eunuch who goes back to Africa. We know that Paul, in his missionary journeys, goes to all these different places all over the world. And we see that by the time the disciples have all been martyred, I think it's Thomas goes to India. So the gospel has spread to the whole known world at the time. And so that happens probably prior to 70 AD. That whole known world has heard the gospel. Well, he says that the church will be persecuted. Verse 9. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death and be hated by all nations because of me. Well, it's interesting that prior to 70 AD, as Paul is going around starting churches, who is the largest antagonist towards Paul and his ministry? It's the Jewish people. And you read in Acts that as he travels to spread the gospel, the Jewish leaders of these different communities follow him and try to sabotage his ministry. Sometimes they even kill people or arrest people. Towards the mid to late 60s and around Emperor Nero joins in this persecution. He starts persecuting Christians. So the early church would have understood what persecution meant very early. You know, persecution isn't something new that's just started today. But persecution has always plagued the church from the very beginning. Even, I would suggest, persecution starts with Jesus, and we just live in the shadow of his persecution. Well, let's go to this idea, this great tribulation that Jesus talks about. Surely that has to refer to a future time. But the reality is, Jesus is probably talking about the great tribulation is the fall of Jerusalem itself. And I'm going to try to go quickly through this. If you do not like history, I apologize immensely. But it is extremely important for our passage. So, in 66 AD, there were some Greeks that supported Rome. And again, the Jewish people at this point had so much of the Roman Empire, they were sick of it. And so they're like, you know what, these Greeks are supporting Rome, we're going to stop them, we're going to attack them. Well, because of their attack, that causes a guy named Gessius Florus, who liked to guess. I don't know, I just made that up. But Gessius Florus decides that he is going to steal stuff from the temple in response to what they've done. And then he encourages people, hey guys, let's go into the temple and let's just start worshiping our gods in there. And so because of that, Jerusalem revolted against the Roman Empire and they pushed the Romans out. Some of the Romans are like, oh man, these guys have gone crazy, we surrender. And hold on, they say we surrender, and the Jewish people get these surrendered Roman soldiers and they hang them, they kill them. And so that launches this back and forth war in Israel between the Jewish people and the Romans, and just constant back and forth. And Galilee gets captured, but the Jews are able to recapture it, and Rome is pushed out and they're humiliated and taunted. So in 67 AD, Emperor Nero says, you know what, we're done with this. There's no reason this little nation should push us around. And he sends General Vespasian, his son General Titus, to go to Galilee and just take the northern part of Israel, establish military dominance, and they do. In 68 AD, they decide now we're going to go to the southern part of Israel and conquer them as well. To announce that they've arrived, they take a bunch of dead bodies of the Jewish people and put them in the Jordan River and send them downstream. Now imagine you're a person doing your laundry or dishes or whatever. I don't think you would do dishes in the river. But you're doing your laundry in the river and you just see this swarm of dead bodies flowing in. War had been declared. And so a lot of the religious zealots living in the southern part of Israel say we need to get together. We need to form an army. And the zealots believe that God had called them to fight in militaries against all these other nations, and that the kingdom of God would be won through military might and power. And so everyone goes to Jerusalem, and they attack a Roman garrison. They push it out, and as a result, Rome says, we are going to declare war on the city. So Rome goes to the city. Jerusalem has 3 walls of protection. They bust through the third wall very easily, and the Jews are able to keep them from getting into the second wall for, I think, for like 7 months or something. And so the zealots, while they're in here, they're like, we need to get people excited for war. We need to get people to fight to their dying breath. And they're like, we have an idea. Let's take all the extra food and let's just burn it. So the zealots set fire to all their extra surplus food. And the idea is, if people are hungry, they will fight stronger. It's kind of like that Aesop story where the fox is chasing a rabbit, and the rabbit outruns the fox, and the fox is just kind of huffing and puffing against a tree. And another animal comes out and says, man, fox, you're pretty slow. And the fox says, no. I was running out of sport. The rabbit was running for his life. So that's kind of what happens here. The zealots say, if we've got plenty of food, people are just going to be lazy. But if we burn all the food and they have to fight for survival, they will join forces. And so all the food's burnt. Bad news is the Romans set up a siege around the city. So now nobody is allowed to leave the city to go get more food. And on top of that, there's a famine that hits. So we have 3 things that are preventing them from getting the food supply they need. And people begin to starve. Lots of people starve. I forget the exact statistic that's given, but it is a lot of people die of starvation. And then the zealots say, okay, who's the religious leaders? Do you agree that what we're doing is right? And if any of the religious leaders disagree with the zealots, they gave them peanut butter to the throat. They're dead. And so there's already a lot of people dying in Jerusalem even before this happens. And what makes it worse is there's a pilgrimage that happens. So all these Jews from all over the world are coming to Jerusalem, and Titus says, come on in, guys, but they won't let them back out. And so now we're already low on food, and we're getting more and more people coming in. And if people try to escape, the Romans will take them and they will crucify them on the outer third wall, so that as people are standing on the second wall looking out, they see all their dead friends and family hanging there. This is a horrible time. And so finally, in 70 AD, they breach that second wall and they get into the city. So all the people fled to the temple. And the temple was designed by King Herod to be a fortress. It was a place that could not be penetrated. And it actually takes 4 months for the Romans to bust through the temple walls. Imagine a church being that thick that it would take 4 months to break into your church. But anyway, while they're waiting to get in, a Roman soldier gets so angry, he throws a torch over the wall and it sets the inside of the temple on fire. The fire is so hot in there that it begins to melt all the gold that decorates everything, and the gold begins to creep into the cracks of the stones. And finally, the Romans bust through the temple wall, and they kill whoever they come in contact with, whether they're men or women, whether they're elderly, able-bodied people, or children. Regardless, they get murdered. It's a massacre. And so Josephus records that 1.1 million Jews are killed that day, and 97,000 were taken as slaves. Fortunately, the Romans get so tired of killing people that they're done. They can't do it anymore. And so fortunately, some people are able to be spared from that. But it is an onslaught. And this is what's crazy. This fire gets started in the temple. The historian Josephus, who documents and records all of this stuff, says there's so much bloodshed that day that the blood literally flows and it literally puts out the fire in the temple. That's gross. It is a bloodbath. And so, again, to summarize all that, that tribulation that Jesus is referring to is probably referring to that time period of the fall of Jerusalem. So we come to this passage where it says that at that time the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And we might say, clearly, this is referring to Jesus' return. But it's interesting, in the Old Testament, when it says that the Son of Man is coming, or whenever it talks about God coming in a military conquest, it's always this depiction that God is riding in the clouds to bring judgment on a nation. And so maybe Jesus is referring to here that he has come on the clouds to declare judgment on the city of Jerusalem. That they have rejected him as Messiah and they're going to be held accountable for that. It is interesting that one of the things General Titus does is he flaunts and brags that the God of Israel is fighting on his side. Now, I don't know if God appears to him and says that or if he's just kind of being boastful and silly. But we do see in this passage that that's kind of true. That just like God used the Babylonians in the Old Testament, now he's using the Roman army in the New Testament. And then I think finally, Jesus says, on that day the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Well, surely that means like these stars will come down on earth and meteorites and comets. But it's interesting in the Old Testament that they used to call their celebrities stars. That's a weird thing. We would never call our celebrities stars. Actually, we do. And whenever one of these political celebrities would die, they would say a star has fallen. Isaiah 14 verse 12 is a good example of that. How you have fallen, king of Babylon, meaning that his time has come to a close and he's like a star that's fallen down. So this verse 29 means that a lot of these Jewish political celebrities at the fall of Jerusalem, peanut butter to the throat. And so, again, we go through all this for verse 34 when Jesus says, this generation will not pass away before this happens. So, all of this destruction of Jerusalem, all this imagery that Jesus uses, will take place in the lifetime of those disciples. And so you might say, well, shoot, those are all my passages that I went to talk about Jesus' return. Is Jesus going to return now? If all these passages that we point to refer to the fall of Jerusalem, what do we use? Well, Matthew 24 still talks about Jesus' return. And we see a segue about halfway through, maybe around verse 36, we begin to see this idea that Jesus is now speaking beyond the fall of Jerusalem and speaking more about his return. And then, of course, in chapter 25, he's going to give 3 very powerful parables about his return. And so what I would suggest to you is this. One, be encouraged. When Paul talks about the return of Christ, Paul says, here's 3 things we need to do. 1, we need to be alert. We need to be waiting and watching for Jesus to return at any moment. And it could happen even before I finish this video. You might even be saying, I hope it happens before you finish this video. Secondly, Paul says we need to be self-controlled. We need to live as if Jesus could return at any time. Live a life of holiness. Love God, love others, make disciples. But thirdly, he says, we need to encourage one another. As we live this life, just say, hey, you know what? Jesus is returning one day. That will give us the encouragement to get through another day. So we do believe that Jesus is going to return. I humbly ask, as we look at Matthew 24, that we allow the context to also speak to us. And in biblical passages, we always want to look at what the text is actually saying versus what we want it to say. So with that, I hope this has been insightful. I hope this has been encouraging. Was it encouraging or was it just a bunch of facts? I don't know. Please don't tell me in the comment section. But anyway, we'll come back tomorrow and we'll look at living a life of servitude from John chapter 13. And we'll look forward to being together in the near future. And until then, have a great day. Bye.